There's something about old bookstores that draws people in. The musty scent of aged paper, the quiet whisper of pages turned by gentle hands, the way sunlight filters through dusty windows to dance across leather-bound spines. But at Butterfly, pages, nestled in the heart of Cedar Grove's historic district, it wasn't just the books that held secrets. The owner, Margaret Chen, aged 58, moved through her store like a shadow among shadows, her silver-streaked black hair always neatly twisted into a bun, her reading glasses perpetually perched on the bridge of her nose. Local customers knew her as the quiet Asian woman who could find any book in her labyrinthine store, who hosted weekly reading circles for neighborhood children, and who made the best jasmine tea this side of the Mississippi. What they didn't know, what nobody in Cedar Grove knew, was that Margaret Chen wasn't her real name, and that the slight tremor in her right hand wasn't from age but from a bullet wound sustained in Kandahar 15 years ago. Detective James Morrison, one of her regular customers, often wondered about her. 23 years on the force had taught him to read people, and something about Margaret's eyes caught his attention. The way they constantly scanned her surroundings, how they lingered on exits and entrance points, her habit of positioning herself with walls at her back. But Morrison kept his observations to himself, content to browse her excellent collection of true crime books and engage in quiet conversations about local politics. "Strange weather we're having," he commented one October morning, while Margaret rang up his latest purchase. Outside, unseasonably warm winds stirred fallen leaves into miniature cyclones along Cedar Grove's brick sidewalks. "Change is coming," Margaret replied softly, her accent a gentle blend of Asian and Midwest American that somehow seemed both exotic and familiar. "Best be prepared." She wasn't talking about the weather, though Morrison wouldn't understand that until much later. Margaret had noticed things changing in Cedar Grove over the past few weeks, new faces appearing in her store, browsing but never buying. Black SUVs with tinted windows cruising slowly past her shop, the way her neighbor, old Mrs. Patterson, had been nervously avoiding eye contact since those men in expensive suits visited her last Tuesday. The Costello family was moving in on Cedar Grove, extending their reach from the city. They'd already bought out 3 businesses on Main Street, offering deals that couldn't be refused. But Margaret's bookstore occupied a prime corner location, and more importantly, the building's basement had once housed a speakeasy during Prohibition, with tunnels that connected to other historical buildings, tunnels that could prove useful for certain types of business operations. That afternoon, as Margaret shelved a new collection of poetry books, the bell above her door chimed. 2 men entered, one tall and lean like a whip, the other built like a brick wall. Both wore suits that cost more than most of her customers made in a month. They moved through her store with the casual arrogance of predators, running their fingers along book spines, occasionally pulling one out, only to carelessly shove it back. "Miss Chen," the tall one smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "I'm Michael Costa, and this is my associate, Mr. Burke. We represent a development company interested in properties in this area. Do you have a moment to discuss a business opportunity?" Margaret pushed her glasses up her nose, her movements deliberately slow, deliberately frail. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy with inventory today, gentlemen. Perhaps you could come back another time?" Costa's smile didn't waver. "This won't take long. We're prepared to offer you twice the market value for your property. Cash deal, no questions asked. You could retire comfortably, maybe open a smaller shop in a quieter area." "Thank you, but I'm not interested in selling." Margaret turned back. To her shelving, her movements measured and precise. "Now, if you'll excuse me." "Ma'am," Burke spoke for the first time, his voice a gravelly rumble. "You might want to think carefully about this offer. Cedar Grove's changing. Be a shame if anything happened to this beautiful store of yours. Books burn so easily." Margaret's hands didn't pause in their work, but something shifted in her eyes, a momentary flicker, like lightning glimpsed behind storm clouds. "Is that a threat, Mr. Burke?" "Just an observation," Costa cut in smoothly. "Think it over. We'll be back tomorrow for your answer." He placed his business card on a nearby table. "For your consideration." After they left, Margaret stood motionless, among her beloved books, feeling the familiar ice-cold clarity she hadn't experienced in 15 years, settling over her thoughts. That evening, after locking up Butterfly Pages, Margaret took her usual route home, but not for her usual reasons. She walked slowly, appearing to any observer as nothing more than an aging bookstore owner tired after a long day's work. But her meandering path served a purpose, taking her past specific vantage points, allowing her to spot the black SUV that maintained a discreet distance, its headlights dark in the growing twilight. In her modest two-story Victorian home, Margaret prepared tea with mechanical precision, while her mind worked through scenarios and contingencies. The house, like everything else in her carefully constructed life, had been chosen with purpose. Its basement connected to Cedar Grove's old storm drainage system, providing an emergency exit route. The walls contained reinforced plates behind. The vintage wallpaper and every window frame was equipped with subtle sensors that would alert her to any intrusion. As she sipped her jasmine tea, Margaret's fingers traced the familiar scar on her right wrist, hidden beneath a delicate jade bracelet. Bangkok, 2003. The mission that earned her that scar had taught her valuable lessons about underestimating opponents, lessons the Costello family was about to learn themselves. Her burner phone, unused for years but still maintained with religious dedication, contained only one number. She stared at it for a long moment before setting it aside. Not yet. There were protocols to follow, steps to take before reaching out to her old handler. First, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. Margaret spent the next hour at her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed databases that officially didn't exist. Michael Costa, former enforcer for the Gambino family in New York, moved west 5 years ago to help the Costellos expand their territory. 3 suspected murders, no convictions. Burke, real name Robert Burke Rossi, dishonorable discharge from Marine Force Recon, history of excessive violence. The Costello family's recent expansion into Cedar Grove was part of a larger pattern. Small towns with historical architecture, old tunnel systems, convenient access to interstate highways. A soft chime from her security system alerted her to movement in her backyard. Margaret didn't turn on any lights or move to the windows. Instead, she pulled up the feed from her carefully hidden cameras. 2 figures in dark clothing were examining her back door, while a third kept watch near the garden gate. Amateurs. They'd missed the pressure sensors in her garden path, the ones disguised as decorative stepping stones. She allowed herself a small smile as she pressed a sequence of keys on her laptop. Her garden sprinkler system activated suddenly, startling the intruders. But it wasn't water spraying from the carefully modified heads. It was a fine mist of capsaicin solution, the same compound found in pepper spray. The night filled with cursing and coughing as the men stumbled away from her property, their eyes burning. A warning shot across the bow, subtle enough to maintain her cover but clear enough to send a message. She had no illusions that this would deter them. If anything, it would make them more determined, but it would make them cautious, buy her the time she needed to prepare. Margaret spent the rest of the night in her basement, opening hidden panels in the walls to check equipment she hadn't touched in years. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, cleaned and oiled and ready. Her fingers lingered on a particular case, remembering the weight of its contents, the way it had felt like an extension of her own body during countless operations in countless dark corners of the world. Not yet, she told herself. She told. Violence was like a poem. Timing and rhythm were everything. Rush either, and you destroyed the effect. Dawn found her back at Butterfly Pages, opening the store as if nothing had happened, but subtle changes had been made during the night. Certain books now concealed small packages behind them. Security cameras had been adjusted, blind spots eliminated. The old ceiling fans had been carefully rebalanced, their blades now capable of serving a very different purpose, if needed. Detective. Morrison arrived at his usual time, just after opening, but today he wasn't alone. His partner, Sarah Chen, no relation, a young Asian-American officer who'd recently transferred from Chicago, accompanied him. As Margaret watched them browse the mystery section, she noted the way Sarah's eyes took in the store's layout, the way she positioned herself, the almost imperceptible bulge of a backup weapon at her ankle. This wasn't a coincidence, and Margaret felt the first stirrings of concern. Either the detective's suspicions had grown stronger, or someone else had taken an interest in Butterfly Pages. Either way, the game was becoming more complicated. Sarah Chen moved through the bookstore like someone mapping terrain, her casual browsing a thin veneer over professional assessment. Margaret noticed how the young officer's gaze lingered on the newly installed ceiling fans, the slight tilt of her head as she registered the faint smell of gun oil beneath the usual bookstore scents. "Interesting collection you have here," Sarah commented, holding up a rare first edition of Sun Tzu's Art of War. The translation notes are unusual, a specialty import, Margaret replied softly, from a private collector in Hong Kong. The two women's eyes met over the book, each recognizing something in the other that the rest of the world wasn't meant to see. Before either could speak further, the store's bell chimed. 4 men entered, not Costa and Burke, but clearly cut from the same cloth. They spread out among the aisles with practiced casualness. Detective Morrison tensed slightly, his hand drifting toward his concealed weapon, but Margaret caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. The detective frowned, but stayed put, watching as one of the men approached the counter. "Package for you, Ms. Chen," the man said, placing a manila envelope on the counter. "Boss says to read it carefully." Margaret opened the envelope with deliberate slowness. Inside was a stack of photographs. Her house at night, her walking to the store, her having dinner at her favorite cafe. The final photo showed her garden from the previous night, with 3 figures rushing away through the mist. A handwritten note accompanied the images. "Nice security system. Hope you've insured the rest of your inventory." "I'll need time to consider your employer's offer," Margaret said, her voice steady. The man leaned forward, invading her personal space. "You've got 1 hour. Boss doesn't like waiting." After they left, Sarah Chen casually walked to the windows, watching their departure. Black Escalade, no plates, 3 more vehicles on standby around the corner. She turned to Margaret. "They'll be back with friends." "Sarah," Morrison started, but his partner cut him off. "She knows, Jim, don't you, Ms. Chen? Or should I say Agent? That name doesn't exist anymore," Margaret interrupted quietly. Like many others, Morrison looked between the two women, decades of detective work finally clicking into place. "You're not just a bookstore owner, are you?" "Right now, that's exactly what I am," Margaret replied, moving toward her office. "And if you both want to stay safe, you'll leave and forget what you've seen." Sarah's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Little late for that. The Costellos didn't just happen to pick your store. Someone talked, gave them information about the tunnels, about you. They're not just looking for a property acquisition. They're looking for leverage." Margaret paused at her office door. "Against? There's a federal task force preparing to move against their entire operation. They need an escape. Route contingency plans, these tunnels, they're perfect. And a former operative with your particular skill set. Even better. How do you know all this?" Morrison demanded. Sarah's smile was thin. "Because I'm the one who's supposed to be watching her. FBI counterintelligence. The task force needed to make sure certain retired assets stayed retired." She turned to Margaret. But now we have a problem. The Costellos found you first, and if they know about you, others will too. Margaret absorbed this information with the same calm she'd once maintained during firefights and interrogations. The game board had just expanded significantly. Pieces she hadn't known were in play revealing themselves. She thought of the metal case behind her office wall, of skills grown dusty but not forgotten. 1 hour, she said finally. That's how long we have before they return. Detective Morrison, I suggest you call in some uniforms, have them evacuate this block. Make up a reason, gas leak, structural issue, anything. Sarah, I assume you have a go bag nearby. The FBI agent nodded. Good. Because in about 55 minutes, this quiet little bookstore is going to become a very different kind of educational establishment. Margaret moved through her store with practiced efficiency, her movements precise and purposeful. Each book she removed revealed a hidden compartment. Each drawer she opened contained more than just paperwork. Sarah watched with professional appreciation as an arsenal emerged from the most innocuous hiding places. Originally CIA, I'm guessing, Sarah said, checking the action on a suppressed Sig Sauer that Margaret handed her. Southeast Asia operations, probably late 90s to early 2000s. The less you know about my past, the safer you are. Margaret pressed 3 specific volumes on a shelf in sequence. A hidden panel slid open with a soft click. Detective Morrison, I understand if you want to walk away from this. What's coming, it won't be by the book. Morrison, who had just finished calling in the evacuation order, holstered his phone. I've spent 23 years watching this town, protecting it. I'm not stopping now. He paused, studying the array of equipment Margaret was retrieving, though I'm starting to think I never really knew what I was protecting it from. The hidden room behind Margaret's office was small, but efficiently organized. Maps of Cedar Grove's underground tunnel system covered one wall, with key intersections and access points clearly marked. Another wall held surveillance monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the store and the surrounding streets. They're moving, Sarah reported, watching the screens. 3 vehicles approaching from the east, 2 from the south. They're blocking potential escape routes. Margaret allowed herself a small, cold smile. They think they're hunting a retired operative. They should be asking why I chose this location, this building, this town. She opened the metal case she hadn't touched in 15 years. Inside, nestled in custom foam padding, lay a disassembled rifle that had once been her constant companion in darker times. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over as she assembled the weapon. Each click and snap was like a word in a familiar prayer. The tunnels under this building don't just connect to other properties. During the Cold War, they were modified by people who believed in having contingency plans. People like me. Morrison watched in fascination as sections of the basement floor revealed hidden panels. The Historical Society never mentioned this in their records. That was rather the point, Margaret replied, checking her watch. 40 minutes until they expect. And answer. Sarah, contact your task force. Tell them the Costellos are about to make a move, but leave my name out of it. As far as they're concerned, this is just another organized crime operation, getting aggressive with local businesses. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And what will it actually be? A lesson. Margaret's voice carried the same gentle tone she used when recommending books to customers, but her eyes had changed. The kind bookstore owner had vanished, replaced by someone who had spent decades surviving in the world's darkest corners. They chose this location because they thought the tunnels would give them an advantage, an escape route. They're about to learn that confined spaces are only an advantage if you know them better than your opponent. She moved to a vintage radio cabinet, pressed a hidden switch. The back panel swung open to reveal modern communications equipment. Detective, I need you to coordinate with your officers above ground. Keep civilians clear, but don't engage directly. Sarah, you'll monitor their communications. I suspect they're using military-grade encrypted channels. The equipment here can intercept them. And you? Morrison asked. Margaret checked the time again. I'm going to go shelve some books. At their confused looks, she elaborated. Every book in this store has a specific place, a purpose. When the Costello's men come through that door, they'll find themselves in a carefully curated collection, one where every line of sight is measured, every shadow calculated, every angle considered. She chambered around with practiced ease. In 35 minutes, butterfly pages will become their required reading assignment, and I intend to be a very strict teacher. Above them, the first sirens began to wail as Morrison's officers implemented the evacuation. On the monitors, more black vehicles appeared, taking up positions around the block. The Costellos were mobilizing in force, clearly believing that overwhelming numbers would guarantee their success. But as Margaret watched their deployment, she saw only targets arranging themselves exactly where she'd planned for them to be, like pieces on a chessboard, moving precisely according to her design. The evacuation had cleared Cedar Grove's historic district with remarkable efficiency, leaving the autumn-painted streets eerily empty. Through the bookstore's vintage security cameras, Margaret watched Costa and Burke emerge from their vehicles, now accompanied by what appeared to be a full tactical team, men in dark clothing, carrying military-grade weapons, moving with the coordinated precision of professional operators. Ex-military, Sarah observed, studying their movement patterns, probably Blackwater or similar. The Costellos aren't taking any chances. 14 men total, Margaret noted quietly. 4-man teams approaching from 3 directions, plus Costa and Burke holding back as command element. Her voice carried the same tone she used when discussing rare book acquisitions. They're being careful, methodical. They saw what happened in the garden and adjusted their approach. Morrison checked his service weapon, looking uncomfortable. We're outnumbered almost 5-1. Numbers stopped mattering to me after Karachi, Margaret replied, making minute adjustments to the store's environmental controls. What matters is understanding the battlefield. She gestured to the rows of bookshelves. Every aisle in this store is exactly 7 feet, 4 inches high. Standard night vision goggles have a vertical field of view of 40 degrees. At close quarters, that creates very specific blind spots. The temperature in the store began to drop as Margaret manipulated the climate control system. Cold air sank to the floor, creating layers of temperature differentiation that would play havoc with thermal imaging equipment. The vintage ceiling. Fans spun lazily, their specially balanced blades generating subtle air currents that would affect both sound propagation and any gas-based weapons. Sarah's radio crackled. They're on an encrypted channel, but the equipment's picking it up. They're discussing structural entry points. Teams 1 and 2 will breach through the front and side doors. Team 3's going for the roof access. Perfect, Margaret whispered. She moved to her desk, pressing a sequence of hidden buttons. Throughout the store, subtle mechanical sounds whispered behind the walls. Detective Morrison, take position in the true crime section. The shelves there are reinforced. Steel covered with wood veneer. Sarah, the military history alcove has the best view of both entrances. What about you? Morrison asked. I'll be introducing our guest to the classics section. Margaret checked her watch. 3 minutes until their deadline. They'll wait 2. More minutes to show dominance, then breach simultaneously from all points. She touched the jade bracelet on her wrist, a gesture that seemed more habit than nervousness. Remember, they expect to find a retired operative, someone who's grown soft and careless. They're prepared for resistance, but not complexity. Use that. The first sign of breach came exactly as Margaret had predicted. Multiple small charges detonated simultaneously at different entry points, charges designed to minimize damage to the historic building while creating entry paths. But as the teams began their assault, They found themselves entering an environment that had been carefully crafted for this exact scenario. The front team encountered a fine mist of aerosolized binding glue, a special mixture Margaret had prepared using supplies from her book restoration work. Their expensive tactical gear began to stick to itself, movements becoming restricted. The side team found themselves navigating through aisles that seemed to shift and change, mirrors and carefully arranged books creating false perspectives that made distance and direction difficult to judge. The roof team, perhaps the most professional of the three, successfully breached through the skylight only to find themselves dropping into a carefully orchestrated web of nearly invisible monofilament lines, the same type Margaret used for securing rare manuscripts. Their controlled descent became a tangled mess. In the chaos of the first 30 seconds, none of the intruders noticed that certain books had been positioned to reflect light in specific ways, creating blind spots exactly where Margaret had planned her first counterattacks. From her position among the leather-bound classics, she allowed herself a small, cold smile. The real lesson was about to begin, and like any good teacher, she had prepared her material meticulously. Costa's voice crackled over their communications. "Status report, all teams!" But the responses he received were not what he expected, and in the growing confusion, a quiet figure began to move through the shadows of the bookstore, selecting targets with the same care she once used to select first editions for her collection. The first team leader went down silently, a precision strike to his carotid artery, leaving him unconscious between the philosophy and religious studies sections. His radio continued to transmit his team's increasing confusion as they encountered what seemed like impossible angles and shifting shadows among the bookshelves. "Contact! She's in the..." The transmission cut off abruptly. Sarah, positioned in her alcove, watched with professional appreciation as Margaret seemed to materialize from nowhere, disable two men with ruthless efficiency, and vanish again before their teammates could respond. The FBI agent had seen skilled operators before, but this was different. This was art. "Team 2, push through to the rear office," Costa commanded over the radio. "Team 3, get clear of those wires and secure the upper level." Morrison, from his position behind the reinforced true crime shelves, observed the tactical team's growing frustration. Their military training worked against them here. They were looking for traditional cover and movement lanes in an environment that had been subtly altered to create false ones. Every bookshelf that should have provided protection instead left them exposed to angles they couldn't anticipate. One of the operators, moving past the rare book section, triggered a mechanism Margaret had adapted from archival preservation equipment. Suddenly, the air was filled with a fine powder, a mixture of binding chalk and phosphorescent conservation dust. Their tactical lights and night vision equipment transformed the cloud into a blinding glare, destroying their adjusted vision. "Switch to thermal," someone shouted. "Negative," came the response. "Getting weird readings. Temperature variations everywhere. Can't get a clean signature." Margaret's voice floated through the chaos, seemingly from multiple directions at once. In 1918, the British Special Operations Executive developed a technique for using libraries as safe houses. Would anyone like to know why? A burst of automatic fire shredded a shelf of poetry books, sending paper flying. Margaret clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "First editions of Frost. That's coming out of your hazard pay." Sarah caught glimpses of Margaret's strategy now. She wasn't just disabling the intruders, she was psychologically dismantling them. Each encounter left them more uncertain, more aware of their vulnerability. The bookstore had become a maze, where every corner held potential threats, every shadow might conceal their target, and their own tactical responses were being turned against them. Through the cameras, they could see Costa getting increasingly agitated. "Burke, take 4 men and sweep the basement. She has to be using the tunnels." "I wouldn't." Margaret's voice drifted again. "The basement contains my collection of unstable 19th-century chemical treatises, very volatile when disturbed." She was lying, probably, but the brief hesitation her words caused was all she needed. Two more operators went down near the historical fiction section, their weapons disabled with precision shots from Margaret's suppressed pistol. The remaining members of Team 2 started to bunch up defensively, abandoning their training in favor of mutual protection. Morrison keyed his radio. "Sarah, they're clustering near your position. Third aisle from the west wall." "I see them," Sarah replied softly. "Miss Chen, I have a clear shot at their flank." "Not yet," Margaret's voice whispered through their earpieces. "Wait for my signal. Detective Morrison, when I give the word, I need you to create a distraction, something dramatic." Morrison smiled grimly. "I may have an idea. Been wanting to try this since I saw your modifications to the sprinkler system." Through the chaos, they could hear Burke's team reluctantly moving toward the basement stairs. Costa was shouting increasingly desperate orders, trying to regain control of an operation that had spiraled far beyond conventional tactical responses. "9 down," Margaret's voice came again, calm as if she were discussing inventory. 5. More upstairs, 4 moving to the basement plus Costa and Burke. Phase 1 complete. There was a pause, then, "Shall we begin the advance course?" Burke's team hesitated at the basement entrance, their professional instincts warring with the growing certainty that they were dealing with something far beyond their experience. The chemical treatise threat might have been a bluff, but after witnessing their colleagues' systematic dismantling upstairs, they weren't eager to test that theory. "Move in!" Costa's voice crackled through their radios. "She's trying to psych you out. It's all smoke and mirrors." At that precise moment, Morrison executed his distraction. He triggered a modified sequence in the sprinkler system, but instead of water, the pipes released a carefully prepared mixture of theatrical smoke and powdered luminescent bookbinding material. The combination created an eerie, glowing fog that seemed to crawl along the floor and up the walls. "What the hell?" One of the operators backed away, his weapon tracking the unnatural phenomenon. "This is some ghost house his words, cut off as Margaret materialized behind him, her movements a fluid blend of techniques learned in a dozen different countries. He dropped without a sound. Sarah used the confusion to reposition, sliding through a hidden passage between the stacks that Margaret had shown her earlier. The FBI agent found herself gaining a new appreciation for the layers of preparation involved. This wasn't just a defensive setup, it was a masterpiece of tactical architecture disguised as a bookstore. "Team 3, report." Costa's voice had lost its smooth professional edge. No response came from the upper-level team, just the sound of static. "Perhaps," Margaret's voice drifted through the smoke, "we should discuss your employer's offer again. I'm thinking a different kind of transaction." A burst of automatic fire tore through the mystery section. "Show yourself!" Burke shouted, his composure cracking. Interesting choice of words. Margaret's response seemed to come from everywhere. At once, thanks to a carefully hidden speaker system she'd integrated into the shelving. "Let's talk about choices. You chose to threaten a bookstore owner. Your employer chose to believe I would be an easy target. Now you're choosing to destroy priceless first editions in a tactically useless display of frustration." 2 more operators went down near the reference section, victims of Margaret's silent approach and devastating close-quarters expertise. Their radios continued to transmit their unconscious breathing, adding to the psychological pressure on their remaining colleagues. Costa, watching his carefully planned operation dissolve into chaos, made a critical error. "Burke, forget the basement! Burn it! Burn it all!" "I wouldn't advise that." Margaret's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "The ventilation system has been modified. Any smoke will be channeled very specifically. Would you like to guess where?" Morrison, understanding the hint, triggered his next prepared surprise. The ceiling fans, which had been slowly redistributing the glowing smoke, suddenly reversed. The mysterious fog began to spiral downward, creating vortexes that seemed to reach out with ghostly fingers toward the remaining intruders. "Sir," one of Burke's men broke in, panic edging his voice. "We need to pull back. This isn't... We're not equipped for this." Sarah, now in position behind the military history section, caught a glimpse of Margaret moving through her carefully crafted chaos. The former CIA operative flowed like shadow-given form, each movement precisely calculated, every angle of attack considered and exploited. This wasn't just combat. This was decades of experience expressed as lethal choreography. "Last chance," Margaret announced, her voice now coming from the store's main speakers. "Surrender now, and we can discuss terms. Continue, and I'll be forced to start the advanced reading list. I should warn you, the failure rate is rather high." In response, Burke raised his weapon toward the closest speaker. But before he could fire, a single shot rang out, precisely placed to strike the weapon's gas tube, rendering it useless. The message was clear. Margaret could have taken a killing shot, but chose not to. It wasn't mercy. It was demonstration. Through the store's security feeds, Costa watched his operation crumble with the same helpless fascination of someone witnessing an avalanche. His remaining men were scattered, disoriented, many nursing injuries that had been delivered with surgical precision. None were fatal, a detail that somehow made it worse. She was toying with them, demonstrating her superiority with each calculated strike. "Enough!" Costa shouted into his radio. "Burke, fall back. Everyone fall back to..." He stopped as his phone buzzed with an incoming text. The message made his blood run cold. "Check your accounts." Across town, in the Costello family's secure office, alarms were beginning to sound. Their encrypted servers were being systematically breached, their digital defenses falling as efficiently as their physical forces. Someone was dismantling their entire operation piece by piece, using access codes that only their highest-level operators should have known. "You didn't really think I spent 15 years just selling books, did you?" Margaret's voice purred through the bookstore's speakers. "Knowledge is power, Mr. Costa, and I've had plenty of time to learn about your organization's particular weaknesses." Sarah monitored the police bands from her position, hearing the reports starting to flow in. Joint task force teams were hitting Costello properties across 3 states, armed with intelligence that had somehow been extracted from the family's supposedly secure servers. "The thing about running a criminal empire in the digital age," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she used when recommending books to children, "is that everything leaves traces. Banking records, communication logs, the evidence of every crime, every bribe, every murder. It's all there if you know where to look. And I've had 15 years to look." Burke, his weapon disabled and his team in shambles, backed toward the front entrance. "What do you want?" "Originally, to be left alone with my books. Now." There was a pause, filled only by the soft whir of ceiling fans moving the luminescent fog. "Now I think it's time for a change in management. The Costello family's tenure in Cedar Grove is over." Morrison, watching through a gap in the shelving, saw something shift in Costa's expression. The man reached inside his jacket, not for a weapon, but for a phone. "If you think you can threaten the family..." "Oh, I already have," Margaret interrupted. "Check your messages again." Costa's phone buzzed once more. This time, the text contained a video link. The footage showed his boss, Anthony Costello himself, being led out of his home in handcuffs by federal agents. The timestamp was from 10 minutes ago. "Impossible," Costa whispered. "The safe house location was compartmentalized. Nobody knew..." "I particularly enjoyed that shell game you ran through the Cayman Islands," Margaret said, as if discussing an interesting plot twist in a novel. "Very clever, but you should have paid more attention to the cleaning service at the safe house. Maria says hello, by the way. Her children will have an excellent college fund, courtesy of the FBI's witness protection program." The revelation hit Costa like a physical blow. They'd vetted every guard, every security measure, but the cleaning lady. She'd been there for years, practically invisible. Just like a certain bookstore owner had been invisible right up until the moment she wasn't. Through the swirling luminescent fog, Margaret finally emerged into plain view. She moved with the same careful precision she used while shelving rare books, her reading glasses still perched perfectly on her nose. The jade bracelet on her wrist caught the ethereal light as she raised her hand, holding what appeared to be a simple remote control. "Now then," she said softly, "shall we discuss the terms of your immediate surrender? Or would you prefer to learn why I spent so much time in the architecture and engineering section of my inventory?" Above them, hidden servos whirred to life, and the bookstore's structural supports began to shift in ways their original builders had never intended. The game was entering its final phase, and Margaret had saved her most impressive modifications for last. The bookstore's transformation was both subtle and profound. Shelves began to rotate on hidden pivots, creating new corridors while sealing off others. The floor itself seemed to shift, slight changes in elevation herding Costa's remaining men into increasingly confined spaces. Even the ceiling panels were realigning, channeling the ethereal fog into specific patterns that made depth perception nearly impossible. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Margaret's voice carried a professor's enthusiasm. The building's original structure was remarkably adaptable, something about the Victorian-era architecture. They built things to last back then, to evolve. Sarah watched in professional admiration as Margaret's endgame unveiled itself. The bookstore wasn't just a fortress, it was a machine, a precisely calibrated instrument of containment. Each mechanical movement, each architectural shift had been planned years in advance. "Your dossier," Costa said, his voice tight with realization. "It said you specialized in extraction and containment operations. Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe." "Quite thorough research," Margaret replied, "though you missed the more interesting assignments. Tehran, 2001, Santiago, 2004. She adjusted her glasses with scholarly precision. "Would you like to know what they all had in common?" Before Costa could respond, another series of mechanical transformations rippled through the building. The remaining tactical team members found themselves being systematically separated, corralled into individual sections, by moving walls and rotating shelves. In each operation, Margaret continued, as if giving a lecture, the key wasn't overwhelming force, it was understanding space. Control the environment, and you control the outcome. The human mind, Mr. Costa, has very specific responses to architectural manipulation. Add in some carefully managed sensory disruption. On cue, the lighting changed subtly, creating false shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The luminescent fog, now flowing through carefully designed channels in the ceiling, formed patterns that triggered instinctive responses in the primitive brain. Suggestions of movement, hints of threats that vanished when directly observed. Morrison, secure in his position, keyed his radio. "Police perimeter reports all external escape routes are sealed. FBI tactical teams are standing by." "Perfect timing," Margaret nodded. "Sarah, if you would." The FBI agent activated a sequence on her phone, and suddenly every digital device carried by Costa's men went dark. Their communications, their tactical positioning systems, even their sophisticated night vision equipment, all crashed simultaneously. "A localized EMP burst," Margaret explained. "Very low yield, carefully focused. Wouldn't want to damage my more sensitive equipment, or the first editions. Some of them have preservation sensors." Burke, his back literally against a wall that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago, finally broke. "Costa, we need to surrender. This isn't a bookstore, it's a damn trap, and we're already caught." "Excellent observation," Margaret smiled, "though I prefer to think of it as an elaborate teaching tool. Today's lesson has been about assumptions. You assumed I was a soft target. You assumed your superior numbers and modern tactical equipment gave you an advantage. Most critically, you assumed that 15 years of quiet meant 15 years of complacency. The mechanical transformations reached their conclusion. Costa's remaining forces found themselves isolated in separate chambers formed by repositioned shelves and structural elements. Each space was a perfect cell, secure yet comfortable, with carefully chosen books placed within reach. I've selected reading material appropriate to each of your backgrounds. Margaret's voice came through hidden speakers in each chamber. Mr. Burke, given your military experience, I think you'll particularly enjoy the collection of classical strategy texts. Mr. Costa, I've included several excellent works on corporate governance and RICO statutes. Consider it preparation for your upcoming legal proceedings. The luminescent fog began to dissipate, revealing the bookstore's new configuration. What had once been an open, welcoming space now resembled something between a maze and a precision instrument. Each shifted wall, every rotated shelf, served a specific purpose in containing and controlling its occupants. Federal teams are moving in, Sarah reported, checking her phone. They've secured the Costello properties in all 3 states. Financial accounts frozen, digital assets seized. It's a complete takedown. Morrison watched through the security feeds as FBI tactical units approached the bookstore's exterior. They're going to have questions about all this, he gestured at the transformed interior. Hard to explain a bookstore that turns into a high-tech prison. Actually, Margaret said, removing her reading glasses to clean them carefully, everything is perfectly documented. Building permits, structural modifications, all filed with the proper authorities. Did you know that Cedar Grove's historical preservation codes have fascinating loopholes regarding architectural innovation in registered landmarks? Costa, contained in what had once been the Civil War history section, laughed bitterly. 15 years. You spent 15 years setting up this operation. Operation? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Mr. Costa, you misunderstand. This wasn't an operation. This was retirement. Everything you see, the modifications, the security systems, the tactical preparations, that was just prudent planning. Insurance, if you will, against exactly this type of situation. She moved to her desk, now the center of a transformed command space, and began typing on her computer. Around the store, printers hummed to life, producing detailed dossiers on each captured member of Costa's team. The thing about selling books, she continued, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency, is that it teaches you to appreciate the long game. Stories unfold at their own pace. Characters develop naturally. You can't rush a good narrative. Sarah examined one of the printed dossiers, her professional mask slipping slightly as she processed the depth of information. This is comprehensive. Account numbers, operation details, historical data going back decades. How did you... Book clubs can be quite informative, Margaret replied with a small smile. Especially when your members include bank managers, county clerks, and the wives of various organization lieutenants. People reveal so much when discussing literature. Patterns emerge. Connections become clear. Through the building's speakers, they could hear the FBI teams establishing their perimeter, standard containment protocols, preparing for a potential hostage situation. Time to end this particular chapter. Margaret sighed. She pressed a sequence of keys on her computer, and the building's external security systems began powering down. The architectural modifications, however, remained firmly in place. Detective Morrison, she turned to the policeman, I believe this would be an excellent time for you to brief your colleagues outside. Sarah, your task force will want to begin processing these gentlemen. I've taken the liberty of preparing individual evidence packages for each prisoner. Morrison hesitated. What about you? I have inventory to sort, she replied simply. These modifications made quite a mess of my shelving system, and I believe my weekly children's reading circle is still scheduled for tomorrow morning." Costa, listening from his improvised cell, couldn't contain himself. "That's it? You dismantle our entire organization, turn a bookstore into something out of a spy thriller, and now you're just going back to reading stories to kids?" Margaret approached his section, her movement still carrying that deadly grace that no amount of careful camouflage could quite conceal. "Mr. Costa, let me share something I learned in my previous career. The best covers aren't covers at all. I love books. I love sharing them with children. I love the quiet life I've built here." Her eyes hardened slightly. "But that doesn't mean I've forgotten who I am or what I can do when necessary." The first FBI teams were entering now, led by agents who stopped short at the sight of the transformed interior. Margaret simply smiled, adjusted her jade bracelet, and began the delicate process of explaining how a simple bookstore had become the centerpiece of one of the most sophisticated takedown operations in federal history. The federal response team moved through butterfly pages with professional efficiency, though their usual protocols seemed somewhat inadequate for the unique situation. Evidence technicians photographed the architectural modifications with barely concealed amazement, while tactical officers secured Costa's men, who had been rendered surprisingly compliant by their experience. "Ma'am," a senior FBI agent approached Margaret, his manner caught between respect and bewilderment. "We're going to need a detailed explanation of all of this." Margaret was busy reorganizing a shelf of Russian literature that had been disturbed during the conflict. "I've prepared comprehensive documentation," she replied, adjusting a collected works of Dostoevsky. "Sarah can brief you on the relevant details. Though I would appreciate it if certain aspects remained classified, it would be a shame to spoil the mystery for my regular customers." In the store's office, now converted back from its command center configuration, Sarah was coordinating with her task force leadership. The scale of the intelligence Margaret had gathered was staggering, not just on the Costello organization, but on dozens of connected criminal enterprises across the country. "It's like she created an intelligence network out of book clubs and coffee shops," one analyst marveled, scrolling through the data. Social connections, financial trails, operational patterns, all gathered through casual conversations and carefully tracked borrowing habits. Morrison, giving his statement to federal investigators, found himself struggling to describe exactly what he had witnessed. "She turned their own assumptions against them," he explained. "They thought they were hunting a retired operative, but they were actually walking into the most sophisticated trap I've ever seen." Outside, the autumn sun was setting over Cedar Grove, painting the historic district in shades of gold and shadow. Local news crews had gathered at the police perimeter, their cameras capturing glimpses of handcuffed men being led from the bookstore. The official story, a successful federal operation against organized crime, would make headlines, but the full truth would remain known only to a select few. Burke, being processed for transport, looked back at the bookstore with a mixture of respect and residual fear. "You know what the scariest part was?" he told his FBI escorts. "The whole time she was teaching us. Every move, every countermeasure. It was like some kind of masterclass in tactical humility." Margaret's reading room cells were being dismantled, each one revealing new layers of ingenious design. Engineering experts marveled at the precision of the mechanical systems, the way each component served multiple purposes while maintaining the building's historical aesthetic. "The really brilliant part," Sarah explained to her superiors, "is how she hid it all in plain sight. Every modification was legally documented. Every system had a legitimate purpose for a bookstore. She created a fortress that nobody recognized until it was activated." As the federal teams worked, Margaret calmly prepared for the next day's operations. She updated her inventory lists, noting which books would need to be replaced due to damage during the conflict. She arranged orders for repair materials, scheduled cleaning services, and updated the community bulletin board with next week's reading circle topics. "You're really just going to go back to running a bookstore?" Costa asked as agents prepared to transfer him to a secure facility. "After all this?" Margaret paused in her work, considering the question. "Mr. Costa, let me recommend some reading for your upcoming time in federal custody. Start with Sun Tzu. Pay particular attention to his thoughts on appearing ordinary. Then perhaps some Le Carré. His insights on the relationship between seeming and being are quite profound." She adjusted a display of children's books, ensuring they were at the perfect height for tomorrow's young readers. "Besides," she added with a small smile, "who says running a bookstore wasn't my most effective cover all along? Think about it. What better way to monitor a community than from behind a desk where people come to explore new worlds and share their stories?" As night settled over Cedar Grove, the federal teams began their withdrawal, taking with them the prisoners and evidence of one of the most remarkable operations in recent law enforcement history. The bookstore's transformable elements had been reset, its secrets once again hidden behind shelves of carefully curated literature. Sarah lingered after the others had gone, watching Margaret meticulously straighten a display of first editions. "You know this isn't over," the FBI agent said quietly. "The Costellos had connections. Other organizations will have questions about what happened here." "They always do," Margaret replied, not looking up from her work. "That's why I maintain subscriptions to certain international newspapers. The obituary sections can be quite informative." She adjusted her glasses. "Speaking of which, you might want to monitor developments in Geneva over the next few days. Some of Mr. Costa's overseas associates are about to experience unexpected financial difficulties." Morrison, completing his final sweep of the premises, shook his head in amazement. "The whole time I was coming here browsing your true crime section, you were actually writing a chapter of your own." "Detective," Margaret smiled. "Every bookstore is a repository of stories. Some are printed on pages, others written in the spaces between them." She moved to the children's section, where scattered picture books needed reorganizing. "Tomorrow, Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter will want the new dinosaur book she's been eyeing. Life goes on." But even as she spoke of normalcy, subtle changes were already rippling through the underworld. In various cities, certain individuals who had connections to the Costello organization were quietly booking flights, closing accounts, erasing digital footprints. The message spreading through shadowy channels was clear. Someone had transformed a simple bookstore into an instrument of unprecedented tactical precision. The implications were causing ripples of paranoia through criminal enterprises worldwide. "We've identified 3 other organizations showing sudden interest in Cedar Grove," Sarah reported, checking her secure phone. "They'll want to know how the Costellos were dismantled so completely. Then they should visit during business hours," Margaret replied calmly. "The architecture and engineering section has been particularly well stocked recently, though they might also benefit from our selection on historical failures in military intelligence." A soft chime from Margaret's computer drew her attention. Lines of code scrolled across a hidden screen, reporting activations of dormant surveillance protocols. In various global locations, the ripples were spreading faster than expected. "You've been planning for this," Sarah realized. "Not just the Costellos, but whatever comes after." "Planning implies specificity," Margaret corrected, moving to the poetry section. "I prefer to think of it as maintaining awareness. Every person who visits this store tells a story, in their choices, their conversations, their silences. Patterns emerge, possibilities become apparent." Morrison watched her methodical movements with new understanding. The book clubs, the reading circles, the community events, they're all intelligence-gathering operations, aren't they? They're exactly what they appear to be, Margaret countered. That's what makes them effective. People reveal themselves most honestly when discussing stories they love, worlds they dream of, characters they relate to. She paused at a shelf of mystery novels. Though I admit certain international wire transfers are easier to track when you know which banker's wife is secretly reading trashy romance novels. Sarah's phone buzzed again, more updates from her task force. The Costello operation's digital infrastructure was yielding unprecedented intelligence. Networks were being exposed, connections revealed, all meticulously documented through years of patient observation and careful notation. Your retirement, Sarah said slowly. It wasn't really retirement at all, was it? Margaret adjusted her jade bracelet, a gesture that now carried new meaning. Retirement is a matter of perspective, Agent Chen. Some people garden, some play golf. She glanced at her security monitors, where new patterns were already emerging in the data streams. I chose to curate stories, some bound in leather, others written in encrypted data, all of them waiting for the right reader to appreciate their significance. Dawn was approaching as the last federal vehicles departed Cedar Grove, leaving behind a town that would never quite be the same. Margaret stood at her store's window, watching the eastern sky lighten with the promise of another ordinary day. Except now, the ordinary had revealed itself to be anything but. I've been authorized to offer you a formal consulting position, Sarah said, laying a sealed envelope on the counter. The Bureau could use someone with your perspective. That's thoughtful, Margaret replied, beginning her morning routine of checking return books for damage. But I already have a job, one that keeps me quite busy enough. She paused, examining a coffee stain on a borrowed copy of The Art of War. Though I'm always happy to provide book recommendations, Morrison, who had stayed to help restore order to the disrupted shelves, noticed something odd about the returning morning light. The windows, he said suddenly. They're not just windows, are they? Margaret adjusted her glasses. Technically, they're optical surveillance arrays disguised as period-appropriate glass. The Historical Society was quite proud of their authentic restoration project. They even gave me an award for historical preservation. Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent update. We've got movement in the international markets. Someone's trying to trace the financial trails you exposed. Multiple servers accessing the Costello data simultaneously. Right on schedule, Margaret nodded, moving to her computer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating sequences that had been prepared years in advance. They're following carefully prepared breadcrumbs. By this time tomorrow, 3 different organizations will have convincing evidence that their own trusted lieutenants were behind the Costello takedown. The implications were staggering. You're not just dismantling one criminal organization, Sarah realized. You're creating a cascade effect. They'll tear themselves apart, looking for infiltrators that don't exist. People see what they expect to see, Margaret replied, straightening a row of mystery novels, especially when their expectations are carefully curated. Books teach us that, among other things. Through the store's hidden systems, they could track the growing chaos in the criminal underworld. Emergency meetings being called, assets being moved, loyalties being questioned, all following paths that Margaret had laid out years ago, like chapters in a book she'd written, one subtle manipulation at a time. The children's reading circle, Morrison said slowly. The one you're hosting this morning. Is that part of some operation too? Margaret's expression softened genuinely. Detective, some things are exactly what they appear to be. Those children need stories, need to believe in worlds bigger than their own. She touched the jade bracelet, a gesture that now seemed less nervous tick and more conscious reminder. Sometimes the best cover is simply doing what you love. But even as she spoke of simple things, her systems were tracking complex patterns. The morning news would carry stories of mysterious financial crashes, unexpected arrests, sudden retirements. The dominoes she'd arranged over 15 patient years were falling precisely as planned. "You know what amazes me most?" Sarah mused, watching the data scroll across hidden screens. "Not the tactical brilliance or the strategic planning, it's how you made it all look so natural. Like the most logical thing in the world was for a retired operative to run a bookstore in Cedar Grove. Stories work best when they flow naturally," Margaret replied. "When each development feels inevitable in retrospect. The same is true of intelligence operations." She paused in her work, considering, though I suppose there's not much difference between the two. Both are about understanding human nature, recognizing patterns, and knowing when to turn the page. Outside, Cedar Grove was waking up. Early morning joggers passed the store, oblivious to the invisible ripples emanating from this quiet corner of their town. Soon, parents would arrive with their children for story time. Elderly readers would come seeking recommendations. Students would huddle in the cafe corner with their textbooks. The bell above the door chimed precisely at 9 o'clock as Margaret unlocked Butterfly Pages for business. The first customer was Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter, Emma, her eyes bright with anticipation for the dinosaur book she'd been eyeing. All week, behind her, other children began filing in for the morning reading circle, their parents casting curious glances at the store that had been surrounded by federal agents just hours before. "Will you read us a story about spies today?" one of the boys asked, clearly having heard snippets of adult conversations about recent events. Margaret smiled gently. "I think today we'll read about a butterfly who thought she was just a caterpillar. Sometimes the most interesting transformations are the ones happening right in front of us." Sarah, preparing to finally leave, paused at the door. "You know, there's one thing I still don't understand. Why Cedar Grove? Of all the places you could have chosen, why here?" "Come back at 3, Margaret replied, arranging children's cushions in a circle. "That's when our World War II history group meets. Mr. Jenkins, our retired high school teacher, has some fascinating theories about strategic positioning and defensive terrain." The morning progressed with deceptive normalcy. Margaret hosted the reading circle, recommended books to customers, and handled the usual small emergencies of retail life. But through carefully hidden systems, she monitored the cascading effects of her operation. Criminal empires were crumbling, alliances shattering, decades of carefully constructed networks dissolving into chaos and paranoia. Detective Morrison stopped by again during his lunch break, ostensibly to browse the true crime section. "The FBI's forensic team is still trying to understand how you modified the building structure so extensively without anyone noticing." "The best magic tricks," Margaret responded while shelving new arrivals, "are the ones where all the mechanics are visible, yet no one sees them for what they are. Rather like bookstores themselves, repositories of knowledge hiding in plain sight." As afternoon approached, her computer registered multiple attempts to access the Costello organization's former systems. Each probe triggered its own set of predetermined responses, leading investigators down carefully prepared paths. By sunset, 3 major criminal syndicates would be convinced they'd uncovered evidence of betrayal within their own ranks. "You've started something that can't be stopped," Sarah observed during a final check of the premises. "The ripples will keep spreading. Like a good story," Margaret agreed, adjusting her jade bracelet. "The best ones never really end. They just wait for the next reader to discover them." The day wound down like any other, with Margaret checking returns, updating her inventory, and preparing for tomorrow's operations, both literary and otherwise. Her hidden systems continued their quiet work, monitoring, analyzing, preparing for contingencies that might not arise for years. As she locked up for the night, Margaret paused to appreciate the subtle beauty of her creation. Butterfly Pages was exactly what it appeared to be, a sanctuary of knowledge, a community hub, a place where stories lived and breathed. That it was also one of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations ever conceived simply proved that the best truths often hide within plain sight. "Tomorrow's another day," she whispered to her books, her fingers trailing along their spines with genuine affection. Another chapter waiting to be written. Outside, Cedar Grove settled into its evening routine, unaware that at its heart sat a nexus of global intelligence disguised as a simple bookstore, and behind the counter, a woman who had transformed retirement into perhaps her greatest operation, continued planning her next reading circle, her next community event, her next carefully orchestrated step in a dance that would continue as long as there were stories to be told and secrets to be kept, for in the end, Margaret Chen had discovered the perfect truth. Sometimes the best way to hide is to be exactly who you are, in plain sight, surrounded by the stories you love. And if those stories occasionally involved international intrigue, well, every book has its own genre and every reader their own tale to tell.